As Danny Lang likes to say, Dr. Craig. There it is. But I'm not that kind of a doctor, so, I'll give free medical advice if you like. It's free right out back when we're done. And but don't worry, you will pay. Not for me, but you will pay if I give you medical advice. We're in Job today. We were in Job last week. Pastor Mike is walking us through a series, and of course he's away. And if you've been following them, they did make it to Iceland, right? So last week, he was up here, and they had trouble with their passports and everything. And I guess from what little I know, this is all I know. So hopefully this is right. They did fly to Puerto Rico, got their passports. So good. You all know you've been following them more than me. So, and then they made it to Iceland. So good. Glad that they made it there. And that, as he said, he's not sitting in a Walmart parking lot. So glad that that's not the case. So we're in Job, and we know that Job, as we get started looking at Job, Job is a pretty somber book in a sense, because what it dealing with suffering. And Job, as we found out last week, and we'll put review up here in just a sec, Job was really faced with the worst of it, losing, his family, right, and losing all his livelihood, and then, of course, being tormented himself. God allowed Satan to, put boils on him from the top of his head to the soles of his feet, and he was just, of course, in misery, and he faced some pretty intense suffering. And, the scripture is there not necessarily for us to say, oh, yeah, well, my situation can't be as bad, as Job, so how can I, ever complain? It's not there for that reason. It's there to show us when we do have suffering, how do we handle that? And who do we look to? And what are the circumstances surrounding ours that we can draw encouragement from the scriptures? So to go back to last week, here's some review of what was covered. There's some questions that were answered last week. And if you weren't here, I'd encourage you to go watch that online and get up to speed with our series. So why do we suffer was the first question that was answered last week. And I'm not going to go into answers on these or details, just cover the questions and then some of the concluding statements that Pastor Mike had. So that was the first. The second one, why do some suffer unimaginable loss? And it's true that some do. Some do suffer unimaginable loss that we cannot understand. And that is the reality of life. Third, if God is sovereign, and he is, why does he allow such deep suffering? Why does he allow such deep suffering? And some of the statements that we concluded with, I think that's what I had the guys put up next, that Pastor Mike shared with us. I think there were 3, correct? God desires that we love him for who he is and not for what he does for us or for what he gives to us. God desires that we love him for who he is and not for what he does for us or for what he gives to us. That is a powerful statement, I think, for us and for our faith to realize and to think about that. Why? Why do I put my trust in God? Is it because of the blessings that he gives, or is it solely because of who he is? So great statement. Also, deep suffering reveals our deepest heart toward God. Is he truly enough by himself, or is our devotion dependent on what he does for us? So, it's in those times when we go through suffering, we go through difficult times, that we realize the depth of our faith. And are we dependent on him alone? Is God enough for you, and is God worthy of your worship and trust, even without his good gifts? And we know that he really is. We know that he is worthy of it. And that's a bit of review from last week. And there's 5 questions that we wanted to answer through the book. Today we have 1. I think that's what's next. Is suffering a result of how we live, whether wickedly or righteously? That's what we're looking at today. And we're going to be in Job chapter 2 today. And I'll scare you, but we're in Job chapter 2 all the way to chapter 42. So, yeah, wow. Hope you packed a lunch and a dinner and a sleeping bag, right? No. But this is the question we're answering. Is suffering a result of how we live, whether wickedly or righteously? And this is the question that came up for Job and his 3 friends. And that's what we're looking at, is the story of the 3 friends and when they came to Job to comfort him and how that all went down. And it didn't go down all that well. So we're going to dive right in and look at our text and then comment on some things and try and walk through this and get some good understanding of where we're at. So looking in Job chapter 2, we're going to read, was it 11? Yeah, 11 through 13. I'll just use the screen. That's perfect. Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort, and that's good. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. So here we have Job's 3 friends, and they've heard of all that's taken place in Job's life and all the evil, all the disaster that's come upon him, right? And they say, all right, well, we need to do something here. We really need to go comfort Job. He's probably, in quite a fix. And they formally get together. And how long this took, we don't know, but it is kind of important, I think, to know that there had to be some time in this for their appointment to get made, for them to get together and come formally like this. Because in our day, I think we think about, suffering our own and reactions to that, and everything's instant in our day. Within minutes, we respond. There's a crisis, and within minutes, we know about it. There's a crisis on the other side of the world, and within minutes, we know about it, right? And have the opportunity to respond. It wasn't necessarily that way in Job's day. So by the time his friends had heard about all this had taken place, and who knows how long it took. The text doesn't say, but the text does say that Satan went to the Lord and said to God, hey, what about, Job? You're protecting Job, so if you would stop protecting him, he'll curse you, right? And God said, well, go ahead, you can remove all of his blessings, but you can't touch him. So Satan does. And then the text says there was another time in heaven when the sons of God appeared, and the angels appeared before God, and Satan was with them. So it was a second occasion, and it happens again, the conversation. And God says to Satan this time, okay, well, you can now mess with his life, but spare him his life. That's it, right? You can do whatever you want to him. You just can't kill him, okay? So all this is taking place, and so Job goes through these circumstances, and as we found out last week, of course, in one fell swoop, all that's taken from him. His family's taken from him. His livelihood is taken from him, and he has nothing. Even his wife says you should just curse God and die. And there's an interesting clue there to the book if you want to do some deeper study on that word. It's the word is actually the word for bless, used euphemistically, and it's used 4 different times in those first couple of chapters about blessing and cursing. So, Job, he didn't want his children to curse God, right? So he sacrificed for them and prayed for them after they would feast together at one another's houses. But as we continue on, of course, Satan says to God, Job's going to curse you if you remove everything from him. And then his wife says, you should curse God and die. So interesting clues there to the book. But Job doesn't, of course, give in and proclaims his innocence. But we don't know the length of time that it took to get through all this. So here's Job in his misery. And here's a man who had it all, right? He was a leader in his city. It wasn't just that he was wealthy, but he was very well known and known to be blameless and known to be righteous and upright. He would be one that would be sitting at the city gate with the other leaders of the city, okay? They would look to him for decisions, for wisdom. It wasn't just they would look to him for money. But now, no longer is he sitting at the city gate. Now we find him sitting on a pile of ashes. And the picture that's given, the text, the narrative doesn't really go into a lot of detail on this. But can you just imagine the grotesque sight that was before the 3 friends of Job? Here's a man that Satan had inflicted with boils. From the top of his head to the sole of his feet, his whole body, and he is sitting in ashes, scraping them off. Now, we're not going to go into any gory detail on that. We could get really gross. But the three friends, when they approach, and this is sort of a tough verse here to interpret. And let me read it again. It says, when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept, and then tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. So what's kind of hard to interpret in this is you can't see someone from a distance. When you look from a distance, usually people are not recognizable. I'm finding that out. The older you get, the worse it gets. And, I know that that's Pat back there because I saw him this morning, and I know that's his blue shirt. But I can't tell if he's sticking his tongue out at me or not because I need new glasses. So, that's the way it is, right? The further someone is away, you can't recognize them. And the closer you get, then you come to a place where you can recognize them. But the text says, when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept. Well, somehow in this, though, they did recognize him at some point, and that's what makes this so hard to interpret. And I think the point of it is, how when you see something and you say, is this real? Like, are my eyes deceiving me? When you see some occasion, maybe it's some person like they saw with Job, and you say, wow, it's been a long time since I've seen that person. Is that really them? And you've got to go up to them and find out if that's really them or not because it's been so many years. That seems to be the occasion here, that they did not recognize him. But once they did, they couldn't believe it. They could not believe that this was their friend Job and what had taken place and what he looked like now. And of course, the text says that they mourn. And what's important to note here is that they not just mourn and are upset, but I think here we find a clue into what's going to happen in their response in the speeches coming up. It says that they didn't recognize him, and then they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And then they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word, for they saw that his suffering was great. This behavior of throwing dust in the air and tearing your clothes and weeping, the text says that they wept. It wasn't that they just cried. They cried out aloud. Their behavior was used in the customs of the time for someone who was dead. And it's almost as if the author here is saying when they saw and finally recognized and couldn't believe that this was Job, what they saw was really a man who was dead or about to be dead. And what they started to do was mourn for their dead friend who was just dead but didn't know it yet. And they sat, who knows, for 7 days. Did they sit waiting for that to happen? The text doesn't give us their conversations. It says that no one spoke to Job for 7 days, which kind of seems hard to imagine that they would sit there and not say anything. But it was also a custom of the time when you went to console someone who was grieving, that you would gather around them, family and friends, and you would not speak until they spoke. You would not speak out of reverence for them and their grief, and you would allow them to be the first one to speak. So it could be that it wasn't really the friend's fault in a sense, if you want to say it this way, that it was 7 days and 7 nights that they sat there in silence. It was really up to Job to speak first. That seems to be indicated here. So here's the scenario, and here's the story that sets up what's coming in all these speeches and all this poetry that's coming. So Job is sitting there, and then finally he speaks. And just to give you a little breakdown of what's coming, I just want to look at kind of the structure of what we have coming next. Sorry for the water. It's the nervousness, I'm not used to speaking like this, so I got to have it lest I sound like I'm in 7th grade again. It's bad enough as it is with the water. All right, so next we have not a story or not the narrative. That's what we've just covered. We don't cover that again until chapter 42. So in the middle, from chapter 3 all the way to 42, we have these speeches. And it's poetic. It's all poetry. That's how it's written. Now, yeah, we've had some speeches, we've had some conversations that have come up already in the book, but this is different. You know, in the book, we have the story that starts the book, and it just says, well, this is how it was. You know, God and Satan had this conversation, and then Satan's allowed to come down and, you know, provoke Job and do all this, and there's no word about how Job felt about this or anybody else felt about this, right? Well, you get into the poetry, into the speeches, and you find that. So just to give you an idea, you know, some of the things that are included in all these chapters of this poetry, we have things like parallelism. We have figures of speech. We have metaphors. Don't ask me to explain what all these are, right? Those of you who are into literature and poetry understand this. We have allusions. We have imagery, analogy, all kinds of different ideas, moods and emotions. That's huge, and that's what we hear from Job a great deal. All these moods and emotions that he's feeling come up. Unusual vocabulary, lament, legal metaphor. It gets into really a debate, an argument between Job and his friends, and then Job challenges God and says, if only I could stand before you legally and declare my innocence. Repetition, of course, alliteration, all these unique expressions, as well as symmetrical scheme and aphorism. All of that is bound up in these speeches, in this poetry. So to give you an idea of the structure, we're not covering chapters 3 through 40. We're going to cut that in half. But to give you an idea of how this is structured, from chapter 3 all the way to chapter 27, we have the speeches of Job and his friends. And there's 3 rounds of speeches. So Job speaks first, and then his friends respond, right? So Zophar will respond first, and then Job, rebuttals. And then Bildad, and I forget all the different guys that are included here. Bildad, and then Job, and then Zophar, right? And that's the first cycle. And then we come to a second cycle, and they do this again. They keep going back and forth and back and forth. For all these chapters, 20-some chapters, all of this speech, all of this talk, all of this rhetoric, right? And that's what we're going to cover. But what's interesting is you have in these chapters 3 cycles of speeches. And then following this, you have, if you will, 3 monologues. You have Elihu, and we're not going to really touch on him. This is for you to go do some homework if you like. But Elihu, and he gives a monologue. No one gives any response to him. It's just him speaking. And then there's Job as well, who speaks with no response. And then there's finally Yahweh, God, who speaks. So you have 3 of these arguments that are given, 3 cycles of them. And then toward the end, you have 3 monologues. And couched right in the middle of that is chapter 28. So if you want to do some study, some homework, look up chapter 28 and what chapter 28 is all about and how that relates in the book. Because it's very important, I think, to the whole argument of the book and to wisdom literature. I'll give you a clue. It's the path to wisdom. All of chapter 28 is about that. It's about wisdom. It's attributed to Job, but it may not be Job who wrote it. It may be the author himself that wrote it or someone else. We're not completely sure. But it seems to be significant. So as we look at that, I just wanted you to know what the structure looked like. We're only going to get through chapter 4 through 25, and we're really not going to touch all of that, of course. But I just want you to see a little bit of the arguments going back and forth between Job and his friends. So we're going to cruise through this kind of quick, but we're going to have this on the screen so that you can read it here, and we can kind of follow along through these chapters. So chapter 4, 7 through 9 says this. This is Eliphaz speaking, and he says, "Remember, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off?" He says his point is that they weren't. "As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." Right? You get what you deserve, he'd say. "By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed." This is what Eliphaz is saying, that the innocent never perish, right? The righteous are never cut off. And then Bildad speaks in chapter 8. And his tone seems better, but he still says that Job should repent. Bildad the Shuhite answered and said, How long will you say these things and the words of your mouth be a great wind? Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children have sinned against him, he has delivered them into the hand of their transgression. Hold on right there. Go back to that verse 4. Did you catch that? The audacity. I cannot believe. I mean, if your children were just taken from you, and your friend comes up to you and says this, and says, well, sorry, Job, but you know what? God took them. God allowed Satan to take them because they're sinners. So that's why they were removed. How in the world? I don't know how Job just didn't attack them. But this is what he says. This is Bildad. If your children have sinned, and this is part of his argument we see, if your children have sinned against him, he has delivered them into the hand of their transgression. If you will seek God and plead with the Almighty for mercy, if you are pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore your rightful habitation. Wow. And then Zophar. I know this gets kind of long, but this is good, I think, and helpful for us to see. So Zophar rebukes Job as well. So Zophar the Naamathite answered and said, should a multitude of words go unanswered, and a man full of talk be judged right? Should your babble silence men, and when you mock, should no one shame you? For you say, my doctrine is pure, and I am clean in God's eyes. And that's what Job was saying. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips to you, and that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom, for he is manifold in understanding. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. His point is mercy. That's what he's seeking. And then all this, Job is replying various ways, but in chapter 12 he says, who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this, that this is the hand of God? And he's claiming his innocence, but says to them, I know where this came from. And then Job, of course, says to his friends, as for you, you whitewash with lies. Worthless physicians are you all. You guys came to bring sympathy and comfort, but there's no healing in what you're saying. Job continues and says, oh, that you would keep silent, and it would be your wisdom. You know, maybe you would be better off if you didn't talk. You would appear wiser than you are now. Chapter 13, this is Job continuing on. He says, though he slay me, I will hope in him, yet I will argue my ways to his face. Job continues to proclaim his innocence. Eliphaz again comes back and speaks once again. Should a wise man answer with windy knowledge and fill his belly with the east wind? Should he argue in unprofitable talk or in words with which he can do no good? But you are doing away with the fear of God and hindering meditation before God. For your iniquity teaches your mouth, and you choose the tongue of the crafty. Your own mouth condemns you, and not I. Your own lips testify against you. Job replies in 16, 1 and 2. Then Job answers and says, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. See, you're worthless physicians, you're miserable comforters. You guys are doing a lousy job. You're not such great friends. And they just continue to beat on him. Just a couple more passages here as we end this section. Bildad speaks in chapter 18. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered and said, indeed, the light of the wicked is put out, and the flame of his fire does not shine. Speaking of the wicked and elaborating on who they are. He is thrust from light into darkness and driven out of the world. And he would say, this is you, Job. He has no posterity or progeny among his people, and no survivor where he used to live. They of the west are appalled at his day, and horror seizes them of the east. Surely such are the dwellings of the unrighteous. Such is the place of him who knows not God. Zophar gets one more crack at it in chapter 20. He says, do you not know this from of old, since man was placed on the earth, that the exulting of the wicked is short, and the joy of the godless but for a moment? The heavens will reveal his iniquity, and the earth will rise up against him. The possessions of his house will be carried away, dragged off in the day of God's wrath. And then Eliphaz, in chapter 22, Eliphaz the Temanite answers and says, "Can a man be profitable to God? Surely he who is wise is profitable to himself. Is it any pleasure to the Almighty if you are in the right, or is it gain to him if you make your ways blameless? Is it for your fear of him that he reproves you and enters into judgment with you? Is not your evil abundant? There is no end to your iniquities." There's no end to your iniquities. Bildad ends with chapter 25 will end with this. "Dominion and fear are with God. He makes peace in his high heaven. Is there any number of his armies? Upon whom does his light not arise? How then can man be in the right before God? How can he who is born of woman be pure? Behold, even the moon is not bright, and the stars are not pure in his eyes. How much less man, who is a maggot, and the son of a man, who is a worm?" That's their position for Job. And I think what's going on here is they've really lost sight of not just Job and his situation, but of God and who God is. And these three men were really seeking for an earthly understanding to try and give Job an answer for why he was suffering as he was. And what we find here is what's called the retribution principle. I know it's a fancy word, but we know the understanding of it. You'll get it, and I'll walk through some passages for this. Righteous living brings prosperity, and wicked living brings punishment. That's what the retribution principle says. And we know that it's all throughout the scriptures. You know, you think back to when God placed Israel in the promised land. When they came into the land, they pronounced the blessings and the cursings, right? And they went to the two different mountains, and they put the different camps on each side, and God had given them the covenant. And God said through the covenant to the nation of Israel, generally speaking, "If you will obey me, I will bless you. If you disobey me, I will curse you," right? So the retribution principle is there in Scripture. And what it's trying to do is trying to understand for us the justice of God and make sure that every occasion that we come across, that we perceive it and God to be just. And that's what these men were trying to do. So they were off, though. Eliphaz, for him, Job's suffering signifies a redefinition of innocence. That Job was essentially innocent, but must be suffering temporarily for some sin. For him, the retribution principle holds true even when there's occasions when it appears otherwise. He holds that Job has sinned at some point, even if his life is generally righteous. Innocence then means hardly ever wicked. So he redefines what innocence is. Bildad sees Job's suffering as signifying degrees of the retribution principle and compares Job to his children who've lost their lives. He says, "Well, Job, you're still alive, so you must not have sinned as egregiously as your children did." For Bildad, the retribution principle holds true, but can vary in its degree of offense. Zophar says, no, that's not it. He signifies the standard of retribution itself. At some point, Job has sinned, and so now faces punishment for that sin. He holds that Job is probably a greater sinner than anyone really knows. He believes that God's mercy has already been applied to Job so that the suffering is not as bad as it should be. This is their position. This is what they were holding to. This is what you hear all throughout these chapters of all of this talk, all this rhetoric. Back and forth they go in this debate. And of course, in it have really lost sight of the humanity, of the personhood of their friend Job, who is going through this, who is dealing with this suffering. So time, of course, continues to go by, so we want to get to the end of it. So in chapter 42, we see the end of all this and what takes place. So I'm going to jump there. Chapter 42, 7 through 9. Yeah. So Job, of course, Job's friends were wrong. They were in the wrong, and this retribution principle that they held trying to understand God and God's ways was so blinding to them that they could not imagine that Job was innocent. And through all of this and him declaring he was innocent, they said, no, that can't be. Well, what we find out in the end is that Job is innocent and the friends are guilty. The friends have sinned against Job and against God. So God says, after the Lord has spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my anger burns against you and against your two friends. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore take 7 bulls and 7 rams, which signifies completeness, right? And go to my servant Job and offer a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Job shall pray for you, and I will accept his prayer. Not to deal with you according to your folly, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite went and did what the Lord had told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. It's interesting, God didn't say, hey, I want you to go offer a sacrifice and I want you to pray. No, I want you to go offer the sacrifice with Job, the one who you've accused, right, and have him pray. And it's his prayer to me that I will accept, not yours. At times, I think as we transition from this into how does this impact us and how do we think about this, I think at times we can do this too. We can, in our desire for understanding in difficult times, we can assume certain things of God that are not true. Or we can presuppose on them different ideas that are not true. We may approach a circumstance with a friend, as Job's friends did, and say, there's just no way that you're right in this. There's just no way. And we can kind of be dogmatic in this and kind of hold to our point, right? But that's not how God works, and that's not God's ways. God is above that. God is the one who has created all this, and he's the one who can do whatever he wants in the midst of it. We're not going to take the time to go into it, but just to give you an illustration of how God works in spite of the retribution principle. In the Old Testament, you find Abraham and Lot. And Lot has gone to Sodom and Gomorrah and is living there, but they're wicked people, right? And finally, God comes down with his angels and meets with Abraham, and the angels go off, headed towards Sodom and Gomorrah. And in chapter 18 and 19 of Genesis, it says that God meets there with Abraham. And Abraham says to God, and I'm going to paraphrase all this, of course, but meets with him, and God says, this is what I'm going to do. I've heard the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're going to face judgment. And Abraham says to him, Lord, what if there are 50 righteous there? Far be it from you, the righteous God, of all the earth, in your justice and your mercy. Far be it from you to kill the 50, right, with the wicked. Would you spare the city if there are 50 righteous there? And he's negotiating with God. And God says, yes, I'll spare the city if there's 50. And he says, suppose there's only 5 lacking of that 50. Suppose there's 45 righteous. Would you kill everybody, if there's 45 righteous there? And God says, no, I won't kill the city if there's 45 righteous there. And this continues on, negotiating with God. And Abraham negotiates it all the way down to 10. He says, if there's only 10 righteous in the city, would you spare the city? And God agrees to this, okay? God agrees to this. He agrees to the retribution principle, right? That the wicked should suffer, right? And the innocent shouldn't, right? So what happens? The angels go down to Sodom and Gomorrah and meet with Lot, find out the city is full of wickedness, right? Come to find out there's not even 10 there. They could have gone down to 5. There weren't even 5 righteous. There are really only 3, Lot and his 2 daughters, who come to find out are righteous in the city. And yet in the midst of that text, it says that God demonstrated his mercy to Lot, and the angels pulled them out. God can do whatever he wants in whatever circumstances that we're in. And I know that's hard for us to accept sometimes. It's hard for us to accept that we don't know. It's hard for us to accept that God's ways are higher than our ways, and that we're going to go through life and we and our friends are going to have these occasions that come up. And, a lot of these occasions are not pleasant. They're not pleasant to talk about and think about and, especially to live through. Here we are in the U.S. right now, and there's war going on the other side of the world. And there's a lot of pain and a lot of suffering that you're seeing and I'm seeing as a result of this war. And why? The question why comes up. Why is God allowing this kind of stuff to happen? This does not seem just. Well, I understand that, but we need to be careful that we not draw the wrong conclusions from this. I remember when I was an intern back in Columbus, Ohio, they used to send me to do visitation, hospitals or people's homes. And I went to the hospital this one time to see a man who had had a major, major heart attack. His name was Gary. And I went in to see Gary, and he was stable at the time. He had just had it the night before, but I went in and, I'm young, not, sure exactly what to say and how to say it and stuff. And I went in and I basically said to Gary, God's got this. God's going to see you through. God will, right? And Gary looked at me and said, in so many words, no, that's not going to happen. This is my time. And I was kind of shocked, at that was his position. And the reality was he didn't make it another 48 hours, and he passed. And somehow he knew that this was his time, right? But I misspoke on my part because I didn't say, Gary, you know what? God is such a great God that he could heal you. He could do these things in your life. He can do whatever he wants. No, that's not what I said. I said, Gary, God will. He would. He will. And I made that assumption that God was going to do that work in his life. And God hadn't spoken to me and said, hey, I'm going to heal him, right? I think that's what we can do sometimes in relationships is we can really be well-intentioned and pure in our motives, but not right with the approach. As we try and apply some of this, there's some concluding thoughts that I'd just like to give and like for you to think about. And I think we're going to put these on the screen as well. The first one is this: we don't have all the answers, but God does. So trust him. And that's not cliche. I know that sounds like that can be, but when there are times of suffering, the whole point is that we will be drawn toward God, not away from God. Even when God seems to be unfair and lack justice, he is the one who knows all. He knows all the circumstances that every single one of us in this room are dealing with right now. He knows the purpose behind all of them. He is the only one that we can really trust. That's who God really is. And there's no way that we, this side of heaven, can understand all of the circumstances and all the purposes that God has because he's chosen not to reveal them. I think it's because he wants us just to trust him and trust him more. So we have to be willing to have that kind of perspective, especially when we approach times of suffering and issues with our friends too. Remember that maybe sometimes they just need our comfort. They need us just to be there, to be present, not necessarily to come and give an answer. Maybe we need to focus on them and not focus on the circumstance. Two, there we are. Be open to divine possibilities. What does that really mean? Well, could God be doing something new? Could he be teaching you something new? What presuppositions do you hold that need to be reconsidered? Is there a belief about God that might be an error? We might find ourselves encountering a situation with a friend and it doesn't seem to make sense, and we'll have to be careful how we approach the situation. Will we be open to learn, or will we be closed because of our misguided beliefs? Do we approach others with judgment, in a sense, already having made a decision about their situation, or do we approach them with an open mind. And then the final one is to focus on the sufferer, not on the circumstance. So provide the comfort and support that's needed. Seek God together. Seek his grace and mercy and healing and strength. You know, the amazing thing about God's grace and his mercy in all this, he's not required to give us his grace. And he's not even required when we fail to punish us. That's his mercy. Those things are really his gift to us. He has the freedom to do that. He has the freedom to bestow on us at any point in time more of his grace and more of his mercy, which again should draw us even closer to him. So as we approach our friends, we ought to rely on the God who is and the promises that he has given in his word. I know that looking through these kind of texts, we've flown through this, and there's a lot more there that you really ought to study out. But as we look to a time of invitation, I'd really like to just call all of us to a time of invitation, not just those that might come up front. You know, it's been exciting to be around Fuel these last few months and to see people who have said, you know, I don't have all the answers, but I think I found a God who does, and I want to put my trust in him. And maybe that's been you these last few months, and that's exciting, and we're thrilled to walk through life with you. Maybe you're here and maybe you've never come to that decision yet, and maybe it's because you're trying to find all the answers to all the issues before you say, you know what, I'm going to put my trust in that God. You know, you need to put your trust in that God because you're never going to find all the answers. And maybe that's today. Maybe today's the day you say, you know what, I need to make that decision. So if that's you, we would love to know that. We would love for you to come forward and let us know. We'd love to pray for you in that regard. But there are a lot of us in this room who have already made that decision. And yet we've experienced a lot of suffering, or we know someone who has or is right now. And I would hope and pray that we would be the kind of friend that would not be like Job's friends, right? But would be more like his family and provide the right kind of sympathy and comfort that's needed. So I would just invite all of you, if you're not going to come forward, that's fine, but all of you could think about who that person is right where you're sitting. Who is that person that needs you to bring Jesus to them? And that doesn't mean it's not a non-believer. Maybe it's another believer that needs comfort, that needs encouragement, that needs support, that needs to know that you're there. You know, it's one thing that we gather together and that we say that, oh, you know, we're here for you. Right? It's a completely different thing when you, an individual, walk up to another individual and say, you know, I'm praying for you and I'm there, whatever you need. Or what do you need? How can I help? So who is it that God's bringing to your mind that you can pray about in these next few moments? We're not going to take a lot of time, but we want to give an opportunity for you. And if you would like to pray, we would love to pray with you. So I'd ask you to stand as we close, and we'll open this time of invitation up. Father, we thank you for your word. Thank you for this study in Job and for what we're learning from it. Father, thank you that in spite of circumstances in life that we find challenging, God, that you're there and that we can put our trust in you. Lord, during this time, we just ask that you would have your way in our lives. The invitation is open.
Moving into a response time in our service, and I want to invite you to respond to what the Lord may be doing in your heart right now. We've all sinned against God, and we all need to be forgiven of those sins in order to receive eternal life. If the Lord has convicted you of your own sin, and you understand that you need to receive forgiveness through Jesus Christ, I invite you to make that confession and to respond to His call right now. Forgiveness is only found through the grace of God, through the sacrifice of Jesus' death on the cross. All that's required of us is to believe that this is true and to confess our need of a Savior, confess our need for Jesus. If you're in the services with us today, I would ask you to walk forward and to make this confession public and to begin a life following Jesus. Since you're watching online, if you're ready to make this confession, I ask that you respond in your heart right now where you are. and that you let us know by clicking the link below so that we're able to follow up with you, to pray with you, and to help you begin a faith journey with the Lord. If you've already made this confession and you've not yet been baptized, and I want to encourage you to click the link of baptism below and to sign up for our next baptism at Fuel Church. Baptism is the next step in the life of a new believer, and it's an outward confession of the work of Christ in your heart and in your life. All believers should be super excited to enter into baptism, following after the example of Jesus. This is a time of great excitement and encouragement for the whole church to participate in together. Finally, there's also a link below for prayer. If you need prayer for anything at all, we would be honored to receive your prayer request and begin praying for you. You'll also find in the link below that you can join one of our Bible study groups called small groups. These are smaller groups of people that meet together in their homes throughout the week in order to grow closer to God and closer with other believers. Or you can click the link below to join one of our Fuel teams, a team at church in order to serve alongside others in helping people find and grow in a relationship with Jesus Christ. Thank you for watching today. Our hope is that you respond to the prompting of the Lord and eventually move into our family by joining us in person each week right here at 9 and 11. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace.